why is love so great? From a secularist perspective, love is just an emotion that we evolved because our ancestors who responded to certain environmental stimuli with this positive emotional subset had more surviving offspring than our ancestors who didn't. It's designed to reward long-lasting behaviors, i.e. generally being positive to your own kids, or generally being positive to your spouse, or generally being positive over a long period of time to a community that's nice to you. But it doesn't always motivate pro-social action. The worst atrocities, many of the worst atrocities in history were motivated by love. If you look at the beginning story of the Western tradition, it's Troy. What caused these men to kill? It was love. It was the love of Helen of Troy. Love motivates disaster. When the Greeks first started splitting, again, from the barbaric savages, the core realization they had that allowed them to do that is love is not the thing that you should elevate above all else. Love is no different from arousal or sex or anything like that. Now, this is my cultural framework. I think there's cultural frameworks that work without this. I'm okay with allying myself with people who think love is this great thing. But me personally, no, I think love is dangerous.
Welcome to Conversations. This is your host, Benjamin Boyce, and today's guest is Malcolm Collins of Based Camp. Check the description below for links to his work.
Great.
I have a very fun day today. So I'm interviewing a man that goes by the name of Lomez. He's a dissident right publisher. He's the leader of Passage Press, and he got a lot of press a couple weeks ago because The Guardian came out with a doxing hit piece on him. And then we set this up, and it turns out that The Guardian had a doxing hit piece on you too. So there's a theme already forming in my days.
Oh, no. So it's interesting. A lot of people think that like we got blindsided by that piece or something. We told the reporter to make it as negative as possible. She was planning to make it, and I think you can tell from the writing style of most of the piece that it was going to be a little too puffy. And I was like, the piece won't do well. No one will read it unless you make it some sort of controversy.
Interesting.
So
you
I'm
leaned
actually,
in.
yeah, I'm actually really quite satisfied with the controversial position that we ended up having to stand, which was, very, very light, and it's made clear in the article, very, very light corporal punishment in children, because it's something that, I think it's like 75% of Americans practice, but the media just goes absolutely apoplectic about. So it's very good we have an episode about this on our channel called The Art of Media Baiting, and it's something Trump was really good at, where you take an idea that the very insulated media elites think is horrifying, but that the average American would agree with, and you get them to like take the hook and then show it in front of all these Americans and be like, so a great example of when Trump did this was, when he's like, oh, we don't want to be like one of those shitty countries, like Haiti or in Africa. And the media just went nuts, but the average American is like, yeah, I don't want to be like one of those shitty countries. And so with something like, can you believe they discipline their children? And most people are like, come on. And it's interesting. There's been a bit of, a pushback since the whole viral phenomenon happened, where people are going into the research because a lot of people are like, don't you know that all the research says that this is terrible? And actually, if you look at the more recent research, like there was a piece in 2023 by Lorez, Reitman, and Ortiz called Parental Punishment, Don't Throw the Baby Out with the Bathwater. And it goes through a lot of the old research and shows that they weren't using controls. So they would have these giant sample sizes and be like, look, we have like 100,000 people in it. But they didn't control the behavior of the kids going into the studies, and they didn't control the genetic effects. Now, if somebody doesn't understand how ridiculous that would be to do, in my family, we don't use any form of corporal punishment with our girls. Because they don't act up in the same way our boys do, right? And that would mean, like, if this study included our family, it would include the girls in the no corporal punishment side, include the boys in the corporal punishment side. And of course you see more, aggression and acting out in the corporal punishment side. That's why it was being applied. And so they then went and redid a lot of the literature while getting out those old studies, and they found it actually has positive effects. And it's like, of course it would. Every single long-lived culture in human history has convergently evolved it. And there's this like modern, like past 10 years, elite in our society today who think that they know better than like literally every culture in human history.
Why do you think that that is? I mean, not that they think that they're better than everybody else, but that they would pick corporal punishment or I guess physical communication to a child about bad behavior as off limits.
Yeah. So two reasons, and two very big reasons. So one, when we talk about the urban monoculture in a lot of our stuff, the urban monoculture, just as a concept, is the dominant cultural group in our society. It's what people might call like far progressivism. It's the dominant culture in most large urban centers in the world today.
Yeah.
So this culture's primary value proposition to converts is to say, if you join us, you no longer have to experience any pain, any emotional pain, any in the moment pain. I'll get to what I mean by this in a second. So
no, yeah.
Yeah, somebody can be like, no, the core value proposition is equality. Like, and I'm like, no, that was the value system of the dominant cultural group in the 90s. If you look at the urban monoculture, it will promote some things that seem very strange unless you see them through the eyes of, oh, it's about reduction of in the moment emotional pain. So look at something like the Haze movement, right? The healthy at every size movement, where they're like attacking people for telling usually women that it's unhealthy to be fat. And of course, like in the long term, like a doctor telling a woman, well, you're overweight and this is unhealthy and you should work on it is in her best interest. But in the short term, that's causing short-term emotional pain. Or you can look at things like them banning testing in California. Like, of course, that increases inequality because the rich kids are still going to have their parents send them to SAT testing and stuff like that. But it bans the in-the-moment emotional pain of negative grades. Or you can look at like fentanyl handouts and stuff like that. Like, obviously, the rich people who can send their kids who, get addicted to addiction centers and stuff like that and get them out, like that, it increases the inequality while making it harder for people who are, but removes in the moment emotional pain. This is even what I think we're really seeing with trigger warnings or radical gender affirmation, which is like any way you want to conceive yourself, anything you want to do, we will affirm so long as it doesn't interfere with anyone else. That's like the core mantra of the group. Now, of course, if you have like, my background is in neuroscience. Of course, this would cause like massive neurological problems. You can't just do whatever you want all the time and be affirmed for whatever you want to believe all the time. There is a reason why, like convergently, every religious tradition in the world that was successful evolved some sort of arbitrary self-denial ritual, whether that's Ramadan or Lent or Feast of the Firstborn. But those are often some of the first things they throw out because they're like, oh, there's this emotion. But anyway, so when we are applying punishment to our kids, that is breaking sort of the cardinal value proposition of the urban monoculture. The second reason it does this is an evolved reason. So we're not like the type of people where we think that there's some sort of cabal of elite running everything or anything like that. I think a lot of the negatives we see in our society right now are just random evolutions, like mimetic evolutions. So, one of the things that you've been covering a lot on this channel now is like the detransition movement in places where the trans movement just went like way overboard in some areas. I point out like this is what happened when we created a category like that you can identify with in society that is no one's allowed to criticize anything that category of person does. Well, as soon as you get that, psychologically unhealthy, self-replicating mimetic strains are going to begin to reproduce using that category as cover. In the same way that like when you get certain types of cancer or certain types of disease, they try to tell your body they're actually something super useful. This is like how DEI spreads. It's basically a cancer, but it's signaling to the organizations, if you get rid of me, now you get racism. But anyway, sorry, I'll just close this out really quickly. I know I'm rambling here, but the urban monoculture doesn't need to raise its own kids. It's one of the lowest fertility groups in the world, like anywhere globally. And because of that, it doesn't really have selective pressures, mimetically speaking, on promoting bad child rearing practices. However, because it doesn't have its own kids, it can only survive by converting kids from more demographically healthy cultural groups.
Yeah.
The easiest way, like if you're studying cults, that was always a big fascination of mine growing up, is how did cults work? One tactic that cults do is they try to redefine either normal parenting behavior or something that parents did as a form of abuse, because to really recruit someone into a cultural group that's different from their birth culture, you need to find a way to cut their ties with the people who care about them most, which is generally their birth culture and their parents. If you can recontextualize normal parenting behavior as abuse, that becomes much easier. And you actually see this a lot with like, some of like the more extreme parts of the trans movement was really, I was in the GSA growing up, everything like that, but I do think parts of it have gone off the rail, and you'll see them categorizing, like the way they get kids is they begin to categorize any doubts that their parents have about this process as a form of abuse, which makes it very easy to prevent the kids from conversing with their parents about this like mimetic bubble within their head. And then sort of protects that mimetic bubble from any sort of outside attacks it may have, which is, just from a cultural evolutionary perspective, a very successful strategy. So that's why I think it's doing it.
Yeah. What about, that's a lot. So I had all these different things that you made me think of. And now like, I'm just going to hone in on, you brought up the healthy at every size movement, but you see this also in the sexual liberation movement, but it goes from acceptance, I guess, like from a 90s kind of equality and acceptance thing, and you do you, and as long as it stays in the bedroom, to it has to go out in the street, shout your abortion, put the heaviest model on the Sports Illustrated swimsuit cover, celebrate. It goes from just it's okay to celebration of excess, of degeneracy. What is that? Because what you're talking about, like there's no selective repression mechanism that causes people to say, okay, well, let's just keep it in bounds. It seems like a runaway train, like a slippery slope.
I think that there's two things happening here. I think one is the evolution of a totally new cultural group. And this cultural group is almost like a religion. I won't say something. It has many of the traits that a religion would have, in that it has like beliefs that are not tethered to like secular reality. It has, things that it sees as sacred. It has, so you have this, which is it's mostly what we're talking about when we're talking about the urban monoculture. It has a system for determining what's true and what's not true, which is it's got sort of a academic priest caste almost. One of the things I point out is that if you look at what happened during the Reformation, what you had was one group of people who said truth should be determined by experts. And those experts, so that we know that they're actually experts, should be certified by a central bureaucracy. This was the way the Catholic group largely related to truth. And then another group said, no, that central bureaucracy is prone to corruption, as all bureaucracies are if they're large enough or around for long enough. Yeah. Therefore, truth should always be engaged with completely at the individual level. And this is part of what we're going through in our society right now is a second Reformation, where the urban monoculture relates to truth by saying, well, we should have experts that study truth and then have these experts certified by a central bureaucracy. And now we have a bunch of, we often call it the academic Reformation, a bunch of people out there online who are saying, well, here, here, and here, we can see that the central bureaucracy has become corrupted. My wife was actually going over a study with me just yesterday that I found really fascinating, that found that almost all academics reviewed self-censored now for fear of being fired. And the tenured ones were no less to do it than the non-tenured ones. And anyway, so I found that really fascinating. But so to the question, I think there's two things going on here. You have one, like the larger cultural groups, and that's the urban monoculture, which is bad, but I don't think like horrifyingly bad. But then the urban monoculture created special castes. I mean, there's nothing else really to call the way it relates to, for example, like the trans community, other than a caste. It's almost like a priestly eunuch caste, I guess you could say, like historically, like they reinvented eunuchs.
Slash jester,
and this caste, is given special status, and there's special prohibitions against chastising them, or how you're supposed to relate to them, or how you're supposed to relate to the things they say. And because they did that, because they created an umbrella where you couldn't criticize anything, it led to really, really negative mimetic sets to spread. Like mimetic sets that were so negative, like just as an outsider, you would walk by and be like, that's a stupid thing to say. If you weren't part of the group, or you didn't know that saying that's a stupid thing to say would get you canceled. I don't think that this just happened within the trans movement. Another movement that I think this happened in really badly is the psychiatry movement. So in the 90s, there was this movement of, people shouldn't be afraid to say that they go to a psychologist or a psychiatrist, right? Because there was a lot of negative stigma around it at the time. And that was a positive movement. People really shouldn't have been afraid to say that. But that movement transformed into, no one can criticize you for anything you're doing with your psychiatrist. No one can say, that sounds really psychologically unhealthy. And this allowed for the psychologists that were better at creating, like, just naturally speaking, the psychological techniques that were better at creating repeat business ended up outcompeting the techniques that got people out of the psychologists, because the psychologists were earning more money, better margins, because they didn't need to get more customers. And so psychology, instead of being a practice where you would go to and they would remove, the issues that you were dealing with in life, it became a practice that was almost sort of dedicated to creating dependency. And when I realized this, as I was walking with three women, and one woman was like, well, I would never date a man who wasn't seeing a psychologist. And the other two women like nodded and agreed, like that was a totally reasonable thing to say. And I realized that the psychologist had put into this woman, like all three of these women's brains, accepted them with the idea that you cannot be mentally healthy without seeing a psychologist. And I'm like, that is a cult tactic. That's like both dependency, but then isolating them from external mimetic sources that could lose, that dependency, or could loosen that dependency.
Yeah.
I don't know if that was too.
Well, that you introduce the market forces having bad outcomes for, let's just say, when psychology, if you succeed because you create a repeat customer, is the proper way to work against that tendency to remove the market forces, specifically in mental health care, let's say? Or is it like a multiple pronged attack where you let the thing develop and then you criticize it and then you just kind of deal with the problem down the road?
Yeah, I mean, okay, so you can prevent these negative mimetic bubbles from forming so long as society doesn't normalize any area that you're not allowed to criticize. Like, this is also how you get these cancerous DEI departments forming, because you're not allowed to criticize anything that is seen as antagonistic to racism. And so all they need to do is say, I'm antagonistic to racism, and now they are free from criticism. And so you can get like negative memes boiling up under them. This is where you got this within the psychiatry movement. So as long as you don't normalize that culturally, you can prevent these things. But the problem is we as a society are ruled by a cultural group, like a self-stable cultural group, that has created these protected areas.
Yeah.
And so then that means that us as outsiders, we just need to note where the protected areas are and be aware that unhealthy mimetic clusters are going to have snowballed while claiming that they're there to protect those groups, or that they're part of those groups. And this brings up, I as an adult, like, I can be protected from that, but now I need to think, how do young people get protected from that? How do I help my kids with this? And my strategy broadly is maximal education. I think that the ways, I think that one of the reasons why some of the most toxic self-replicating memes within the trans movement have been so effective is they were very good at getting through a chink in conservative religious armor, which was that these traditions often just didn't engage with sexuality. Now, they did this for an evolved reason as well. So the reason why pretty much every long-lived cultural group on Earth is homophobic to some extent, or like widespread and long lived, whether I'm talking about in Africa or China or early Europe or early America, it's because groups that express homophobia had more kids than groups that did not, because they were able to socially pressure people who were born same-sex attracted to enter heterosexual relationships and have more kids. And so, just from cultural evolution, no one being evil, like those groups became selected. And so even if you had a society that was like, we are okay with gay people in this society, if you had a small subset of that society that wasn't, that mimetic cluster would eventually outpopulate the one that was okay with it, just because they'd be having more kids. Well, so you get this convergently evolved feature of most conservative religious traditions, which is like, one, homophobia, but then two, like a prohibition around pornography, a prohibition around engaging with your sexuality. Why did they do that? Again, historically, it would have led to more kids. If you're not masturbating, if you're not looking at porn, you are going to be doing it with your wife more often, and so you're going to be having more kids. Well, in modern times, what this leads to is a lot of these groups just don't have systems to teach their kids about the arousal patterns they should expect. They don't have systems to teach their kids about a lot of the divergent gender expressions they may experience, or different sexual expressions they may experience. And because there's this whole
black box.
Because for them, the way that they best related to this was just say, well, then don't look at sexuality at all. That's what a lot of them did. Just don't look at it, don't talk about it, don't engage with it. Well, unfortunately, that now means that there's this giant, like, unstructured mimetic portion of the kid's mind, right? And it doesn't have any defenses, because they don't know anything about how arousal works. And now, like a back door in like a computing system, the malactors can just hack right in and build a total mimetic structure in that big void that was left, and build that mimetic structure with all of the little machinery it needs to slowly eat away at the older religious system. And they've done it very effectively. And I think that's one reason why we've seen such an explosion of the urban monoculture reaching out through the LGBT community to recruit people, because it's just a very effective way to do it. Which unfortunately has led to the LGBT community being incredibly victimized by older groups that are having their kid, that they see themselves as having their kids taken from them, because culturally, they technically are. And so then they reach out and they attack the LGBT community, which I think is really kind of sad when the old LGBT community, you look at the old days of the LGBT community, that's mostly gay men. There was a poll done in the last election cycle, 45% of them voted for Trump, or said they were going to vote for Trump. So like, this is no longer like a politically polarized community anymore. And I think that's part of why they keep getting erased on their own flag. The rainbow used to represent total inclusivity. It wasn't like each stroke represented like gays, lesbians. It was everyone under the rainbow. So why do you need special representation? Why do we need some groups are more equal than others? It's because they do need to erase inclusivity based on which groups are most useful to the means of the urban monoculture at the moment. This process is why these groups within the urban monoculture, people are like, why are they obsessed with kids? Why do they always target kids? Why is it so important that they protect stuff like extreme gender affirming care for very young kids? It's just a mimetically evolved thing. When people deconvert from their birth culture or religion, it's typically between the ages of 15 and 21. If they don't deconvert by the age of 21, they're usually not going to deconvert throughout the rest of their life. And because of that, if you lose that window, so like the iterations of the urban monoculture that said, hey, like it's a little squidgy to be like engaging with kids or trying to convert other people's kids, they just didn't replicate as much as the other factions. And so now they're not as represented in the larger behavior pattern of that cultural group.
So reproduction really does have a lot of driving force in any system, whether it's conservatives or the urban monoculture, as you say.
But reproduction of ideas as well, right?
Yeah.
Like just biological reproduction.
Yeah. So again, you're opening all these different doors. How would you go about repairing that ignorance around sexuality, specifically for conservative Christian or even Muslim communities, these communities that are being hacked, or at least their children are being leached from them? Have you thought through
Yeah,
that?
well,
You said
I
education,
often
so I'm sure
find,
you have some.
yeah, no, I have a mechanism. So I think they need to adapt. They need to like, so we wrote the book, The Pragmatist Guide of Crafting Religion, specifically on this topic. Like, why, if you're going to take like 1,000-yard stare, why does your religion have the structures it has? And how can you adapt it for modern conflict? But it does need to be adapted. You know, if you look at rates of religiosity, because a lot of times like religious conservatives find themselves allied with me, even though, you know, we have very different perspectives on a lot of things. And I always like want to tell them, I almost feel like I am, you know, some tribal group on an island, and the European colonists have come with Gatling guns, and the last three groups of my peers with spears just ran over a hill and got mowed down, and they're like, "Oh, I'm going over the hill next," and I'm like, "It's not working." Like the spears don't work against their technology. You are going over the hill with a cultural system that is optimized not for a pre-internet age, but for a freaking pre-industrial age. You are going to get hammered if you do not adapt to the changing technological and sociological landscape. And one of the best ways you can do there is to really focus on sexual education. So like me with my kids, one of my books, The Pragmatist Guide to Sexuality, it goes out and tries to just do a huge overview of human sexuality, all of the research I could find, as deep as I could. And I suspect that sort of the frameworks for sexuality I built in that book are going to be hugely protective to my kids, and going to be protected to most conservative kids. Because they are better systems than the systems that are used by, when I say better, I mean more predictable, more useful at understanding your own sexuality, than the systems that are being used by the urban monoculture that were mostly developed in the 80s, and don't really reflect real human sexuality.
Okay. Like how is like, for example, how are they different? How are these two?
So if you look at the urban monoculture, it predominantly understands sexuality on a Kinsey spectrum, like on a arousal meter that goes from male to female. And that's just not the way human sexual systems really work. Human sexual systems should probably be thought of as a switchboard of meters tied to specific stimuli that go from arousal to disgust. So what I mean by that is one stimuli might be secondary male sex characteristics, or another stimuli might be primary male sex characteristics. Now, this gets really important because you actually find at a rate that is about as high as women being lesbians, males having a preference for male primary sexual characteristics, but female secondary sexual characteristics. Sorry, I should explain. Basically,
Gamps?
futa, right? They
Oh,
want
futa,
something
yeah,
that
okay,
looks like a woman, but has like male genitalia. And that's weird. Like that doesn't make any sense when you're dealing with like a Kinsey spectrum. But also when you're dealing with a Kinsey spectrum, you can't explain things like, actually, I'm like 50% on the male arousal system and I'm like 70% on the female looking arousal system. Or you could be like, I'm at disgust across on the female system, because we argue that disgust is actually part of our arousal system. If you look at what happens when somebody is aroused, their pupils dilate, they look at something longer, they breathe in. When they become disgusted, they typically want to turn away from the thing. They want to hold their breaths and their pupils contract. So we hypothesize with a lot of evidence in the book that these are actually the same system with just a negative number multiple attached to it. And this is why pretty much anything that on average disgusts a large portion of the population is also going to arouse some subportion of the population. And anything on average that arouses a portion of the population is going to disgust some small subportion of the population, just because the multiplier, like the -1, gets left out or added randomly. And this is actually really interesting because people are like, well, everything's a fetish. It's like, no, everything isn't a fetish. Like, people don't have a fetish around like fire. That's not a fetish category. Or falling from high places. That's not a fetish category. But having insects poured on your face is, that's really weird. Why evolutionarily would that ever happen, that a large fetish category would exist around having insects poured on your face or farts or, you know, well, those all would be normal disgust systems that somehow got the wrong modifier attached to them.
Yeah.
Anyway, so this is the model we use in that book. And when you begin to explore sexuality through this model, a lot of things begin to make sense to you that just don't within the urban monoculture. Probably the biggest and most important is that disgust is part of somebody's sexual identity. And the urban monoculture seems unable to recognize this, unable to acknowledge when somebody is like, actually, I know you say like I should be attracted to you because you're a woman, but I experience this strong disgust reaction when I see a penis. And they're like, no, you don't. If you're attracted to women, you are attracted to all things women. And since
like,
we have now
up to and including the
woman,
female penis.
Yeah. And the person's like, that is, but I don't understand. And so now they're gaslighting the person with a false system about how arousal patterns work, just as much as the old religious systems were. And now, because they're the ones gaslighting someone in a way where as soon as I explain my system, they're like, oh yeah, that makes a lot more sense often. Now they have lost this power to gaslight them into engaging with sexually something that they otherwise find disgusting.
Mm-hmm. What's the role of taboo in your system, or like the understanding of taboo? And specifically, I also want to ask about what your teachings will be about pornography, specifically to your boys.
Yeah, so taboo is really interesting. We did a lot of research on this, and basically our conclusion was taboo isn't really directly correlatory to sexuality. There were a lot of older theories about sexuality that making something taboo made it more sexual or arousing. But when I actually started to look, like historically speaking, right, and tried to look for priors, instead what I found is no, it's more just that we have taboos against things we see as sexually deviant or sexual more broadly. And so it's just very common for you to have a correlation between a taboo and something that's arousing. The taboo was like a ward that our culture stuck in the ground to try to ward off an unusual behavior pattern that occurred within a small portion of the population. And now we're like, oh, the wards are attracting these people. And it's like, no, the wards are there because they were trying to keep people away. As evidence of this, there are plenty of taboos that like very few people find arousing, right? Like, you don't, I'm struggling to think of them just off the top of my head, but there's like plenty of cultural taboos that do not directly correlate with something that people find intrinsically arousing.
Bacon sandwiches. Would that count? No.
Well, yeah, I don't know about bacon sandwich or like food taboos. There's lots of food taboos in a lot of cultures, and I've never heard of anybody really engaging with those taboos arousingly, like, or at least any large online communities in my searches that did. But food taboos are put in place for a different reason than sexual taboos. Food taboos are usually put in place not because some portion is aroused by something, but because you might eat something that's going to make you sick, and so we need to create a taboo around eating things of this category.
Yeah, brainworms. Pornography, taboo or no for you?
So I did a lot
specifically
of
in the context of a developing mind, like exposure.
Yeah, this is one of the areas where I'm going to get the most pushback from the type of person who would usually be aligned with me. Well, so first I would say I'm going to separate masturbation and pornography. I don't really think there's any evidence at all that I have found that there is anything negative psychological about masturbation in the absence of pornography. I just have found no evidence at all. Now, masturbation with pornography. This appears to be able to lead to some negative externalities. However, I just don't see those negative externalities as being so dangerous that I would risk banning pornography. And somebody can be like, what do you mean risk banning pornography? When you ban something as a cultural group, now that thing can be used as a hook to grab members of your cultural group and pull them out. Yeah. If I ban pornography, now pornography is a weapon that can be used against my children to try to remove them from the cultural group. I think the better thing to ban is the mandate to sexual full experimentation. I'll explain what I mean by this. There's this weird mandate that's elevated within the urban monoculture, weird from a cross-cultural perspective and even logical perspective, which is that you are supposed to find out every single category of thing that arouses you. And then that becomes your sexual identity, this huge smorgasbord of things that can arouse you. But there's a lot of things that can arouse people that, like, just logically, most people who, you know, once they found out they're aroused by those things, they're like, I wish I never knew I was aroused by this thing. Like, my life would just be much easier had I not experienced, like, maps, for example. Like, why would you ever want to know if you were aroused by that? Like, why would you ever explore that side of your sexuality? And so but once you say that, like, as soon as you say, well, you don't really need to know everything that arouses you. Now, one of the core tools that the urban monoculture uses for recruitment is no longer viable. So that's like a sinful thing to say under this cultural framework. So I think it's easier when I engage with my kids to say, why don't you try vanilla pornography? And I don't really think that you're going to get anything good, you know, just basically walk them through the logic from trying to explore your sexuality deeper than vanilla pornography. Because really your life only gets harder from that point on.
Yeah. Well, what about the detrimental effects of relationships that could be downwind of pornography? Once sex is, I don't know. This is a religious framework, and I know that it's a religious framework, but if sex is turned into something sacred and it becomes, you know, locked into a monogamous relationship and becomes a area that is just private between two people, it becomes something very, very special that's nurtured and then has a life of its own, so to speak. If like pornography and all this other stuff can erode that sacredness, and I know it's religious framework, so there's probably it's not like a database thing, but I'm just wondering what you think about that.
Yeah, so I mean, there's multiple cultural hypotheses which can be stable. Like a culture is a set of stabilizing memes, right?
Okay.
And I think that the framework that you just presented is a self-stable framework for many religious cultural groups. The cultural group that my family is building has gone an alternate pathway because we would actually avoid trying to categorize marriage as something that is sacred or divine in some way, because I would have fears, as I think we have seen in our society, that when you do that and you're like, oh, you're going to fall in love with the right person, blah, 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 you begin to create this sort of magic around the process of courtship, which I think can lead people to make very poor courtship decisions, and that historically isn't really the norm cross-culturally. Actually, the norm cross-culturally historically is to see marrying someone for love as like a very childish thing to do. Because, and actually, people could be like, oh, that's a horrible thing. And it's like, no, your body's like evolved to love the person that you marry. If you look at arranged marriages, they actually have equal rates of love as non-arranged marriages, but that due to survivorship bias, because they have lower rates of divorce, it means that if you enter an arranged marriage, you have a higher probability of loving that person 10, 20 years out than if you marry someone you love. Like, this is not, the love system did not evolve to correctly select partners for us. And when you over mysticize the marriage, now I should state, I teach my kids that marriage is a very important duty. It is a religious duty, but it is a duty that rewards them like any good deed, and shouldn't be thought of as it's like magical thing where everything is gonna work out. And I think that you can get some deleterious things downstream of that. So I don't, I guess, engage with it there. As for like, you know, porn addiction and stuff like that, or like negative ways of relating to porn, I would teach my kids to see their arousal patterns as equivalent to their taste in food. By that, what I mean is they're both things that they're a set of preferences that they have that give them pleasure due to a combination of genetic and sociological effects in society, and that overindulging in certain preferences can lead to negative life outcomes. So with food, when I tell my kid, yeah, you might like the cake more than you like the, you know, that salad, but like, just because you like the cake more than you like the salad, long term, you're going to be better off if you eat the salad and you don't overindulge in the cake. And they go, can I have the cake occasionally? And it's like, yeah, you can have the cake occasionally. But if you start dedicating your life to the cake, that's going to lead to very negative outcomes. And I feel the same about arousal patterns. It's like, look, even if you find some like arousal pattern that's not directly tied to your partner or something like this, and people are like, how dare you tell somebody to control their arousal patterns? You just need to act out all your arousal patterns. It's like, we know as a society historically, like if I tell somebody I might be attracted to my friend's wife, but I'm not going to try to sleep with her, like But we have some phobia around doing this for a very important culturally evolved reason for the urban monoculture, around telling somebody, oh, you're same-sex attracted or something like that. Well, maybe you're like try to find a way to engage with other groups, or or engage in that on the side, but still have a family. Now, those are incredibly offensive things to say, but they are primarily offensive, not because they're like intrinsically any more offensive than me telling somebody who really, really likes cake, you don't need to structure your entire life around your love for cake. They're offensive because they would break one of the primary recruiting processes of the urban monoculture. The moment you tell people, hey, there's some predilections you have that it's just better to learn to acknowledge, but not fully indulge in. And people can be like, well, this is horrible. Then you're saying they can access pornography, but like they should learn to control themselves. They should learn moderation. And it's like, yes, exactly this. I think at the end of the day, this has better outcomes than outright banning. So you look at like, whenever I talk about fertility class, people are like, oh, it's like, porn is like a huge part of the problem. And I go, Korea, the country that is the worst fertility rates, porn is illegal in that country. You shouldn't, when you remove temptation from somebody, you remove the psychological systems for resisting temptation that they previously, you could say it like spiritual fortification. I don't know what word you want to use for it, but the daily resistance of saying, I have access to something like pornography, but I right now am choosing between productive labor or loving my wife or loving my kids and pornography, and I want to be a good person by my moral value system. Which of those things am I choosing? I think that that's a better system for relating to it, while also understanding that everyone, because we're human, is going to sin sometimes. Like I might, for example, think video games are largely inefficacious. But I think if I just completely put video games out of my life, I don't think I would be like a more productive person. I think some other negative thing would come and fill that little void in my life.
Which video game?
So what video game am I playing right now? Right now I'm playing, so I play a lot of XCOM-like games. So that's like my favorite category of games right now. XCOM-like games.
Where you move the little guys around
I used to like
the map.
Civ-like games.
You said
yeah, the guys are on the map and you have a team that you're building. Right now I'm playing King Arthur, Knights of Avalon again. But yeah, so little like reward-based systems.
Yeah.
I find those fun while I'm like editing videos.
Yeah, for sure. So were you surprised when you did, it sounds like you're a first principles thinker. You look at the data and you process things, and then you come up with a hypothesis and then kind of a conclusion, tentative though it may be. Were you surprised over the course of your intellectual development that your ideas have converged or attracted the so-called conservatives? Or was that just... And why? Why do you think that your ideas are in line with what is called conservatism? And then I also want to ask you about the right wing later on after we...
Oh, I really want to answer this question, but I also want to answer one of your previous questions first.
Oh, okay.
There was something you mentioned that I wanted to pull on because it's an idea I've been thinking about recently. Is you were talking about the deification of sexuality. And I think whenever you make any topic totally taboo, you allow a countercultural group to deify that topic as a mechanism of taking people out of your culture. And so I think actually the taboo nature of something allows for the deification of it to be a cultural weapon. And one of the most interesting places this happened, I think, was as society secularized in the early days of the trans movement, like the Tumblr days of the trans movement, the concept of gender began to replace the concept of a soul. They were talking about something, when you remember there were like 30 different genders and they led to who you were as a person, but like they weren't biological and they weren't really part of your psychology. They were something like external to you. And they began to fill the role psychologically for these people in terms of self-framing that the soul filled for these earlier religious communities. Yeah. And these religious communities didn't understand this when they were engaging with these groups. And because of that, they didn't understand when they're just like, well, like, don't over-focus on your gender. It just doesn't matter that much. They're like, that's like saying, live a soulless life within the mimetic structure that they had built. And so there's some really powerful framings there. Now, I want to get to the conservative thing. So I think that right now we are seeing a total political shift in what it means to be a conservative. I think that people talk about, oh, the party shifted, back then, or here the party shifted. I think the parties have completely shifted. Like, you look at Trump, right? Like, in 80 years, they're going to be like, oh, the party shifted when Trump was first elected. And today people are like, what do you mean the party shifted when Trump was first elected? The Republicans used to be like a pro-war, like police the world, like against tariffs, like they free market, like, and now they're what, like a protectionist, nationalist, populist, like union friend. Like, this is not at all the Republic. They have a few axes of which they maintain their historical positions on, but even those axes aren't that strong. Most of the theological positions that the Conservative Party used to have almost completely been dropped. A lot of the so it's really interesting to me. And so as we go through this political realignment, and I don't think it's finished yet, I think the post-Trump era is when the new realigned parties are really going to solidify. I see the Progressive Party right now as representing, like, their core value set is just cultural imperialism of the urban monoculture. They believe that the urban monocultural value set is the correct value set that everyone should be forced to live under. Very similar how the earlier Conservative Party was like the theocrat party and thought that the Christian value set was the value set everyone should be forced to live under. And now, interestingly, because of the dominant cultural force in our society is, I mean, the urban monoculture controls most media, most education, most CEOs of large companies. Everyone fighting against it sees a reason to ally with other people fighting against it, right? So now what the conservative movement has begun to become is an alliance of all of the disparate cultural groups that see themselves at odds with the urban monoculture. And a lot of people can be like, come on, that's not true. And I'm like, who was the most popular, like, by the data, conservative influencer, the year before last? It was Andrew Tate, right? And I go, when he converted to Islam, and he's a Muslim, right? Like, this is a Muslim, right? Most other leading conservatives, like Ben Shapiro, for example, cheered this change because they're like, oh, now he's joined one of these more, this alliance of ideological structures of, moderate conservative Islam. Now, Islamists are actually allied with the urban monoculture for like a very weird reason we can get to in a second. But moderate conservative Islam is very tightly allied with conservative Judaism, with conservative Christianity, with weird secular like beliefs like mine, but then also other communities that were brutalized by the urban monoculture. So an example of one of these communities would be lesbians who felt a large amount of disgust when seeing penises. They basically, like, the entire LGBT rights movement won basically, and then kicked them out. And now they weirdly find themselves allied with this weird conservative alliance. And so this new conservative alliance is true sort of core value is cultural sovereignty and pluralism, which is radically different from conservatives of, the 80s, where it was Christian values. And interestingly, as this shift happened, the dominant conservative group, so if you look at the 80s, right, if you were like, what is the Christian value set that's being pushed, right? People would say, oh, it's Protestant Christian values. What's really interesting is almost every Protestant intellectual has been scrubbed from the modern conservative movement. Most of the dominant leading intellectuals and thought leaders in the modern conservative movement are either Jewish culturally, Catholic culturally, Mormon culturally, or Muslim culturally, which is really an interesting phenomenon. I don't know I have some hypotheses on why that happened. But yeah, so if you were going to say, did I think that I would be called like a staunch conservative, when I was a kid growing up? No, I mean, I identified back then with the Democratic Party, but that was because back then the Democratic Party was aligned with my values, which was always, maximizing individual freedom and cultural sovereignty. And that's why I stood up for like the GSA back in the day, because the dominant cultural group, which was like Christian Protestantism, was against that community and wanted to take away some of their rights. But now we're seeing the exact reverse of that. But my moral positions never changed.
Yeah. Well, the Protestants have gone woke. Just to speak to what you're saying about the conservative wings just don't have any Protestants anymore. The Protestants follow the regime. Because the regime is downstream from Protestantism. What do you mean by cultural sovereignty?
Cultural sovereignty means that I get to live my life the way I want to live my life, raise my kids the way I want to raise my kids. So it means like an pro-cultural sovereignty position would be that my kids should not have to go to public school. I should have the cash, follow the kids, and I should be able to educate them my own way. But cultural sovereignty could also mean that I have the right to practice the sexual practices I want within my own home. Cultural sovereignty could also mean that I have the right to address another person the way that I culturally would want to. So here's where religious groups, where I really strongly disagree with religious groups, is when they have practices that force other cultural groups to do things in a different way. So by this, what I mean is Muslims, for example, saying a non-Muslim can't have a picture of Muhammad. Like, to me, that is a cultural imperialism. That is forcing your viewpoint on people of another culture. But I sort of relate to the trans movement in the same way. Like, I would always correctly gender a trans person because I don't want to hurt their feelings. Like, I don't have any cultural hangups about that. But I can totally understand some cultural group having like saying, actually, like, culturally, I believe I have to gender you by your birth gender. And then they're saying, no, you don't get to live by your cultural standards. You have to live by my cultural standards. And I think that that's a really negative thing to do. So this is what I mean when I'm talking about cultural sovereignty. Is basically being allowed to live by your cultural practices. I mean, a great example is the whole spanking fiasco, basically. I mean, I don't even spank. I think spanking is wrong. I think, for my family at least, I don't think the science backs that up. I think it's in the moment. Mild negative feedback is what the science says works. And so that's what we do. But even that, in a lot of European countries has been made illegal. That's against cultural sovereignty. Or like my family practices like full genome selection of our embryos when we're deciding which kid to implant next. In most European countries, that's illegal. That is an invasion of my cultural sovereignty, me reproducing the way I want to reproduce. And so I think that when conservative religious groups begin to realize it's actually better for their own members to not be assisted in following the harder rules, that they will do better. So I'll explain what I mean by this. And porn is a great example of this, right? When a government bans porn, when a government removes the temptation from an individual, even if it's a culture that has a strict ban on people engaging with pornography, that culture is worse off because you've removed the temptation. You've removed the thing that was supposed to fortify your spirit. And now because you've removed that, you get weaker. You begin to culturally atrophy. And this is why the more conservative a country is in Europe, there's a great study done on this by Arya Babu, the lower their fertility rates. So the more conservative a group is within a country, the higher their fertility rates, because these old conservative systems are often more healthy. But the more conservative a country is, the more they use the government apparatus to sort of act as a mech suit for all of their cultural traditions, and the more those traditions atrophy.
How do you keep a government from being a mech suit for an ideology?
Well, I mean, you just need to understand as an ideology that the points of the restrictions are to fortify your own spirit. They're not to.
Well, yeah, but no, this isn't the case with the urban monoculture. It's actually the opposite case for the urban monoculture. So they just have a different
but the urban
ideology, and they're using government as a mech suit. They're
can't-
prosecuting people for running over sidewalk paintings of rainbows, but you can totally burn a flag, right? Like the
and I
prosecuting.
actually find the whole rainbow thing Yeah, it's really, I went over the whole flag thing, but it's really weird how they have chosen this new rainbow flag as like the flag of cultural domination by the urban monoculture,
Yeah.
i.e. when they, as I point out, like if I'm talking to, because people will be like, there's lots of cultures in the progressive movement. And I go, not really. Like if I talk to a Muslim ultra progressive or a Catholic ultra progressive or a, Mormon ultra progressive, they're going to have the same views on gender, the same views on sexuality, the same views on what approximately on what happens to you after you die. The same views on our relationship to the environment, the same views on what's moral and immoral. And when one of their religious institutions falls to the urban monoculture then puts in front of it often the new pride flag. I call the pride flag that no longer represents inclusivity, but to me an erasure of it, because that's what everything under the rainbow used to mean.
Yeah, the chevron coming in and just gobbling it up like a Pac-Man.
Yeah, and the flag, the line that I often use is I say that the urban monoculture loves the LGBT community in the same way Hamas loves hospitals. They are using this they don't need to put a marginalized community's flag in front of everything they conquer. They control our media. They control our education system. They control most of the world's billionaires. Why are they putting the flag of a marginalized community on everything they conquer? It's like, because it's bull baiting with this marginalized community to take the blunt. Why do they use the cover of this marginalized community? So you'll have these individuals who, like, by no historic definition, when I used to go out there, fight for gay rights, which I still really believe in, the individuals who today on TikTok are saying, like, I am a trans, lesbian woman or something like that, we wouldn't call them that. I'd be like, look, you don't appear to even care if you're passing or not. And you have now identified with the LGBT community. And now you're saying just like the craziest, most urban monoculture things. All you're doing is acting as a lightning rod of anger against the LGBT community by adopting their identity when you don't actually have the challenges or struggles that this community has. But these types of people are very useful to the urban monoculture. One of the things I point out to a lot of my older friends, because they don't know like how bad things are in schools today. Yeah. And I'm like, you've got to keep in mind like how bad the total, like, we will never criticize anything the trans movement does thing is for a local school system. Because if you remember back when you were in school, was there like one guy who like was incredibly sexually aggressive, had like no social skills, was like a total creep? The type of, I remember at my school, this was a guy who, because it was a boarding school, a girl caught standing outside her window masturbating while eating chicken nuggets. Like that, there was that guy, maybe not at every school, but there's that guy at a lot of schools. Well, now
we're gonna have
that
to
guy
take back our whole no food fetish things.
You're right. But now that guy has this out. He didn't have any friends anyway. Now he can just say he's trans and continue to be very sexually aggressive, and people can't fight back in the way that they used to. And you can say, well, a creepy sexually aggressive man, he would never identify as trans just to gain access to women's spaces and to avoid, punishment and criticism. It's like, and then you think for a second, you're like, of course, that's exactly the type of person who would do that. Who do you think suffers for that? Real trans people. This is like, who do you think suffers by now when everybody deals with this guy? The real trans people, I think they want to path. They want to just live life, right? This group doesn't want to do that. And so they've been very useful about redirecting, because this group also has like no social skills. They don't understand that they should not be going on like lesbian only dating apps, and really, if they're aggressively and with a lot of perversion hitting on women, like that's going to cause these women to feel victimized and scared. This group acts as perfect foot soldiers for the urban monoculture, but also acts as foot soldiers in a way that redirects the hatred they generate at a marginalized community, which then the urban monoculture can use to paint their opponents as anti-gay or anti-trans, which is used to justify their moral positions.
Yeah. So, you were talking much earlier. I want to bring it up. This is perfect time to go back there. When you look at New York City, and there's like these weird crime waves that happen. You know, these people who want to limit the police, then end up getting killed by criminals. Somebody stands up on a train platform or in a subway and chokeholds a guy who's threatening other people, and then this guy is vilified and prosecuted because he stood up for, he put an end to criminal activity. And so you see the progressives voting in this way that increases criminality, and that falls on the shoulders of, let's just say, these marginalized groups who will be overrepresented as criminals.
Yeah.
And then everybody directs hate at them and not at the people who are stripping society's safeties, frameworks from people.
Yeah, so this gets really interesting because there's two things happening here. One is the vilification of the exercisement of power. So
yeah,
and then I want to get to the other one, which is a racial caste system. But first, let's talk about. Please remind me to get to the racial caste system. But the vilification of the exercisement of power. So recently, when my wife and I went viral, there were people who were like, "I have proof that they are evil." And that they are white supremacists, they said, like bad guys. And one of the proofs was the names of our kids. They said a number of their kids have Roman-sounding names, like Octavian. And that's a proof that I must be a white supremacist. And I'm like, that's very weird because my white ancestors were like enslaved and beaten by the Romans and then acculturated to Roman culture. Like I am not descended from the Octavians. The Octavians beat my ancestors. And I don't hate that. I look at history and I'm like, well, that means they probably culturally, they had better art than my ancestors. I can look at the beauty of their art. I can look at the beauty of their culture. I can look at the expansion of their empire. I can look at their expansion of civil liberties and say, this is something that I should not deify, but learn from. Like those are things that make something worthy of success. Its ability to exercise its power externally. When the wokes look to history, they do the exact opposite. I mean, you look at something like Bambi Thug, right? If she's looking to a similar period of history, if people saw the Eurovision Bambi Thug, this witch lady, she's looking instead of to the Romans, to the pagans. These are the people I should culturally elevate the most because their weakness is proof of their morality in a historic context. Well, now they begin to see any group that exercises power as intrinsically evil. And police are a group that exercises power. So police, or at least in terms of the state, are now an intrinsic evil. We need a state that is powerless. Now, it's important to keep in mind, now I would divide ethical systems, and people can look at our video on like the tracks of, or like the levels of human thought. But there's consequentialist ethical systems, there's deontological ethical systems, and then there's aesthetic ethical systems. The ethical system that they are using is what I would call an aesthetic ethical system, which is sort of below deontological. So a consequentialist ethical system cares, what are the consequences of the actions that I am doing? If they were consequentialists, they would be like, oh yes, all of these policies we're putting in place are actually hurting Black communities. Therefore we should not put them in place. They do not think about that at all. That is not a thought that crosses their mind. Actually, a really great study that was done recently looked at the career success of Black communities and the IQ measured within Black communities and how far it was from nearby white communities, and then looked at, did they have a conservative leadership or did they have a Democratic leadership? And it was much worse. The difference was much larger in the Democratic regions. The same was actually true for the Hispanic communities in the Democratic regions, showing that all these policies they're putting in place are having an intergenerational deleterious effect on equality. So that's, so then you have the deontological ethical systems. Deontological ethical systems say that what's ethical is set by a set of rules, like don't lie, don't cheat, don't, and as long as you follow this rules set, you will broadly be ethical at the other end of it. And I'm not against deontological ethics. I think that they're very useful for people in societies who aren't leaders. I just think they're very bad for leaders. So like, and this is one of the problems I've always had with like the alpha system. I'm like, no, you really have kings and knights. Knights aren't any less like masculine than kings. In many ways, they're more masculine than kings. But being a follower of somebody else means you need to take on a deontological ethical system if you're going to create good actions in mass. But then you have the lowest form of ethical system. We're not the very lowest, but one of the lowest, which I call aesthetical ethical systems. So these are ethical systems where your ethics is based around an aesthetic. So something that, and you get these really commonly with gender, and you get these on both the right and the left. So I'd say certain trans ideological systems fall into this.
And trads ideological systems.
Trad ideology also falls into this. Like Andrew Tate's ideology also falls into this. Yeah. Where actually Hamza is a better example because you actually see him doing this. When he's making a major life decision, he will ask, what is the most masculine decision I could be making? And then he'll make that decision. That's like an insane ethical system. Why would you do that? Like that is obviously going to lead to Yeah, and I talk about like you have gender dysphoria in the far right just as much as you have it on the far left. Yeah. Actually a really interesting thesis I heard about this in society is everyone now has gender dysphoria because we're not able to enact our gender roles in the way that we used to. And so literally everyone is living with some form of gender dysphoria because you just can't fully masturbate that in the way that historically you would have. But anyway, then on the other side, on the left, was in some extremist trans circles, they're like, I have to act this way because this is how women act. And now I'm a woman. And so everything I do, like, should I do X or Y? Should I take this job? Should I dress this way? I'm saying, what would the woman do? What would the aesthetic? So this is an aesthetic ethical system. They have an aesthetical ethical system around, ironically, weakness and ugliness. And somebody can be like, whoa, that's going way too far. It's like, not at all. If you look at look through magazines, but worse, you can even go back. So I love Starship Troopers. People should check out our episode on, Starship Troopers is the left telling on itself I have ever seen. The guy who was writing it was trying to write a movie that would show why rightist philosophy was so bad. And what he did is he created a world with total gender equality, total ethnic equality, and the only thing that was broke the leftist mindset in this world is that you had to make some form of sacrifice before you could vote. You had to either serve in the military or you had to serve in some sort of public-facing role if you were a pacifist. And that system to the left, they're still like, that is still the highest evil, the Starship Troopers universe. And I'm like, what? Like, we know they got like Steiharshal Tahat Maru. Their entire society was ruled by a Black African woman. They didn't even have gendered bathrooms in the universe. You know, they have the perfection the leftists claim to be fighting for, but because sacrifice is included with the perfection, it is as evil as being a Nazi. Wow. But so I need to go back. The thing that always got me is he goes, I thought everyone would immediately know the movie was meant to be a satire and these people were supposed to be evil because I only picked beautiful actors to appear. And I was like, he literally thought a normal person goes out and sees a group of people and they're all attractive and he thinks they must be evil. That's a fucking insane thought. That is an insane thought, but it is something that is, you know, when they look at the Hayes models and everything like that, it's not just about the in the moment denial. They literally want to glorify the things that cause this internal disgust in people when they first see it, because in sort of the last
Hayes models, I'm
sorry,
losing this reference. Hayes models?
Hayes, sorry, healthy at every size models.
Oh, okay, yeah.
So like the super obese models we see everywhere now, the intentionally ugly models that we see everywhere. Like, sorry, I forgot where I was going. Oh, yes. In the old ethical system, so in the old Christian ethical system, when they ruled everything, the Protestant system, they would drum up popular support with disgust. They'd say, doesn't like this lifestyle incentivize disgust in you? Right? And then people would be like, yes, it does. And they'd say, now that's proof it must be immoral and we should get rid of it. And that was bad. I think that was a bad thing. You know, this is why humans have an evolved disgust against things that are often dangerous to them or that could lower their fertility rates. So you'll see disgust towards like lepers, for example, but we need to learn to overcome that disgust. They were right that was a bad ethical system. But then they inverted the ethical system to an ethical system that glorifies things that cause disgust in the average person.
Yeah, why?
And Well,
Why do
because
why can't they just leave it be? Why do they have to glorify?
because it's a good recruiting mechanism. If you have something about yourself that incentivizes disgust within mainstream society, now they can target that thing about yourself and use that thing to pull you out of mainstream society by love bombing you. So if you are a Christian woman or whatever, but you are obese and you know that like your group shames this and it causes disgust even in yourself, now you've got a group that's going to envelop you and love bomb you. If you have same gender attraction and that, you know, when acted on publicly caused disgust within the old mainstream system, now you've got a group that can surround you and love bomb you to pull you out. Like, it's a very effective technique for pulling people out. Whatever is their biggest, like when you glorify disgust, then you can glorify whatever is any individual's biggest area of self-doubt and sort of organically target those beliefs. I never thought about this before, but very good point. But I want to get to the second thing, which is the racial caste system, which is the secondary issue here. So they have this aesthetic moral system based around weakness and disgust, which is just like the worst moral caste system you can have.
That's how we got Lizzo, right?
Well, and it's and I should point to the end state of this system before I get into the racial caste system, right? Yeah, it is how we got Lizzo. So the end state is because the core goal of the system is to remove in the moment emotional suffering. The end state of the system is the erasure of the human species. This is where the anti-natalist movement comes from. This is where the ethilists come from. This is like the philosopher consequentialist caste of the urban monoculture. If negative emotions are the key evil in the universe, then how do you get rid of negative emotions? You get rid of humanity. And a lot of people can be like, come on, the urban monoculture doesn't say that. Yeah, that's going too far. Yeah. Go to a party in New York. I go to lots of parties with like rich New Yorkers. You know, if you go to one of these fancy schmancy champagne New York parties and you say, well, fertility rates are dropping and humanity can go extinct, guarantee you every time somebody in the room says, but is it really so bad if humanity goes extinct? And then a number of people will nod, Phyllis, is it really so bad? That is an insane thought. From every other cultural perspective on Earth, that is it. Like, you should know that you are in an insane and dangerous thought when somebody can say, is it really so bad if humanity can go extinct? And it's not like record scratch. What did that person just say? You know, you look historically in the last cultural battle, you know, when we were against the communists, you know, the song, like, at least the communists love their children, at least the Russians love their children true, used to be a truism in human history that the side that we were fighting against, the one thing we knew is they still wanted a future for humanity. They at least loved their own children, and that is no longer the case. The urban monoculture, they do not love their children too. They don't have, kids are an innate evil in their end moral state. So that's really scary. But let's talk about, could they get scarier than that? Like, I literally think this group is worse than Nazis, dramatically worse than Nazis, but I'll get to why I think they're dramatically worse. So the final system you have here is the ethnic caste system. So they definitely have a caste system based on ethnicity. The ways that remember when like everyone was freaking out on like us for spanking our kids, and then they're like anyone who spanks their child is like immoral, they are disgusting, and then, you know, we immediately point out, we go, well, you know, there's a study done in 2011 on this showing that 89% of Black families spank their kids, and they're like, well, obviously none of these statements apply to Black people. It's like, why don't they apply to Black people? Like, they're a different caste. They are a protected caste with a different ethical framework that applies to them and a different set of rules that applies to them. And so when somebody of a lower caste, a white person, kills a Black person, even if it is in a justified way, this is, you know, like in India, like if a lower caste person killed a higher caste person, even if it was for just reasons, or in the, you know, ultra racist South, if a Black person killed a white person, even if all the receipts, you know, this white person was threatening another Black person's life, that Black person would hang every time, because that's how racial caste systems work. And what's really interesting, and a lot of people don't see this is a caste system that is always going to turn on the Jews and make them the ultimate evil. A lot of people were surprised when the progressives turned on the Jews. I was not. People are like, why were you not? And it's like, well, you need to understand one of the core assumptions of the progressive, this ultra urban monoculture mindset is all humans are exactly the same. There are no differences between groups. And I always point out this is stupid. Like, why would diversity have value if there's no differences between groups? Like, diversity can only have value if we are different, if men and women are different, if different cultural groups are different. But anyway, that aside, everyone's exactly the same. And because everyone's exactly the same, the only reason why some groups are doing better than other groups is because they have manipulated the system for their advantage and they have oppressed those other groups. And as such, if you have a cultural group that is just uniquely successful, like the Jewish cultural group, and then that cultural group says, actually, historically, we were oppressed and we have the receipts for it, now they're moving to well, that's impossible. You can't be both successful and oppressed. Therefore, your oppression must be a fabrication. And this is where you get like the black communist separatists like burning Anne Frank's diary. This is where you're getting the movements on university campuses right now. They were always fated to turn against the Jews. And I'm just terrified to see where this is going, because I think a lot of people, they don't believe when a lot of like woke people on these campuses are saying, we're going to find this group and we're going to kill them. They don't believe that they're really going to do that. And this reminds me of some of the stories. They
haven't yet, just for argument.
They haven't yet, but that doesn't mean they're not going to. And of course it'll start with, random lynchings and stuff like that. They
went from punch a Nazi to kill a Jew in 10 years.
Well, because they see Jews as the true Nazis. You see, they see, to them, what defines Nazism is strength.
Competence.
Yeah, competence, not the Nazi ideology. And Nazis weren't actually competent, but that's what when they're trying to paint Nazis and Starship Troopers, they paint a society that is totally racially equal. It is totally ethnically equal, but it is a society that demands sacrifice, has competence, and is in a lot of ways in the Starship Troopers universe a beautiful society. It is a society where people dress well
and hates bugs too, which is another
and hates bugs.
Leftist telling on themselves.
Yeah, they're like, the bugs are right. I'm like, no, the bugs are not right. I can't even. I could go so far. Like, we have a whole episode on this where I've actually heard leftists be like, it was a false flag attack. How could it be a false flag attack? The big peanut-shaped asteroid went past the freaking starship when it was outside of Earth's solar system's orbit. Like, sorry, I get too angry about the Starship Troopers movie.
Okay,
we have it at the beginning of every episode. The Would You Like to Know More line. But God, where was I?
Racial caste system.
Oh yes, but here's where I was going. I wanted to talk about fascists. So in the last big conflict we had civilizationally, we had the communists, the fascists, and the capitalists.
Oh, the capitalists. Okay. The liberals and capitalists are the same for you?
Yeah, they're broadly the
Anglosphere,
same.
Anglosphere liberal capitalism.
Yeah, I think most people would agree that they were at least close allies. And I think when people describe the differences between the communists and the capitalists, they're pretty easy to describe, like really simple. They'll immediately go, well, the communists believed that the goal of the state was to run all of the industry of the country and all of the economy of a country and then distribute the wealth to maximize equality. Now, they never ended up doing that, but that was the hypothetical, like ethical goal of the communist system. That was the selling point. And then the capitalists said, no, that'll lead to inefficiencies. Command economies don't work. What you need is every individual under a state to operate sort of individually or self-associate independently. And this organic system will lead to the most wealth for all. Like, this difference is a very easy difference to explain to people. They're like, yeah, I get it. Those are too broadly. But then you go to fascists and they like have this 80-point list of what defines a fascist. And I'm like, no, the fascist system is actually quite easy to understand. You just can't say it because it's just Democrats. The fascist system was an alternate hypothesis. It said, no, the state should control all industry and economy insofar as it can, be efficient with it. But instead of using it to distribute capital equally among the population, it should use it to promote a specific ideological framework that included a racial caste system that Jews were at the bottom of. That is exactly what the left has reconverged around. The belief that the government should control all industry of the state and use that industry of the state to promote their ethical moral system that includes an ethnic caste system with the Jews at the bottom. It's just re-evolved Nazism, but worse, because at least the Nazis didn't want to kill everyone. At least the Nazis didn't worship ugliness, at least, but
so here we go. This is why the urban monoculture, the UMC, is worse than Nazis, because they are totally nihilistic. Totally debauched.
They have all of the bad things. They have the Jew hatred. They have the belief that the state should control everything and use it to promote their ideological agenda. They are an ideology that one day plans to spread over the entire globe. They are completely imperialistic. When I tell them, when you're making fun, like when you're saying all these bad things about people who spank, I'm like, the majority of people in Africa spank. Like, but this is, and secretly in their heads, they're thinking, well, not for long. Like, we'll get them eventually. We'll erase their culture eventually.
We'll trans their kids any day now.
Yeah, there is no stopping point. They want everyone. And so it's an ideology that has a manifest destiny to erase all cultural diversity in the world.
Yeah.
And
turn everything into an airport.
Had that as well.
Where you have different, you can choose between different ethnic foods. Everything's an airport. You have no home, you have no place.
You can choose, but you don't get to maintain your own identity. Not really. You can maintain some sort of cartoonish indigenous view, but not like your real indigenous view, because a lot of things that the indigenous people actually did don't align with what the urban monoculture wants. Like when the urban monoculture learns about like actual African, like traditional African views of gender, traditional African views around like, ways of relating to like weakness in a child or ways of disciplining a child, they're like, oh, I don't want any of that. I just mean like the veneer. They get to practice like 3 holidays and sometimes wear a traditional outfit.
Yeah. Well, this ideology, this urban monoculture, is spearheading a huge global takeover. I mean, they have ESG, they have SEL, they have all of the corporations, they have like the WEF. I don't know to what degree you care about that level of thinking, but I'm wondering, do you think that it's will be successful in conquering the world, and what is the proper way to go about resisting it?
So, again, it's important to remember the urban monoculture is not driven by individual malevolent actors. It is a completely evolved situation that we're in. And as such, and a lot of people are like, no, like there's this bad guy who's doing X. Look, I don't disagree that there's some like wealthy PDA file people. But they're not actually effectively controlling everything. And there's some paganism in wealthy circles, true, but they're not actually, like, it's all evolved mechanistic stuff. And when you understand this, you can actually map what's going to happen while also understanding what's already happened. So you look at something like a DEI department. A DEI department is sort of like a contagious cancer. So what it does is it infects an organization, and it signals to an organization, like many cancers do, I am a very important organ, and if you get rid of me, racism happens. And you're not allowed to question, like, well, if I prevent racism, then you can't question any growth, and the cancers do this. They release chemicals in your body that say, I need more blood vessels, I need more energy. So it does this, and it gets more energy, and then it uses that energy. The whole point of it is to convert as many nodes, like if you think of humans as like individual nodes that exist within sort of nodal clouds in society that partially overlap with different mimetic spheres, to convert as many nodes into the urban monoculture as possible with like testing, with like observation, and then expel anyone who seems immune to this conversion process, or shadow ban them. Like they'll make it so they can't be promoted or voice their opinion or move up within the organization. The problem with this, and then it's when enough, like you get a minimum amount of these infected individuals within an organization, they now instigate the spawning of a new DEI department. So when these people leave and are hired by their companies, as soon as you get a minimum amount, like you basically need to completely ban them from your company if you want your company to stay healthy. This is why when Elon Musk was cutting out the cancer at Twitter, it like 2% of the Twitter staff was left at the end. The cancer runs deep and totally converts organizations once it gets in. People need to understand, like if you would be like a little worried about like a Scientologist preaching at your organization, you should be more worried about somebody like pushing DEI-like ideas at an organization that you have, because it is a much more effective cancer.
Yeah, it's adapted to the post-civil rights moral landscape of
yes,
modern world.
yes, incredibly well adapted. But the problem with this system, you might see it already, is, oh, well, yeah, but it's going to be pretty inefficient, because once it converts all the nodes within an organization, now the nodes only sort of move in and out through osmosis. Like, you would kind of, like from a mimetic standpoint, actually be better if once an organization becomes too woke, it ruptures and releases all the little converted spores out into the environment to be haplessly picked up by other companies, other bureaucracies that aren't paying attention. Well, it has evolved this behavior. It is not a parasite, it is a parasitoid. It kills the host. When the concentration gets too high, like at Occupy Wall Street, or like at CHOP, or like at really the old feminist movement, or like at Jezebel, or like at Kotaku.
Are you going to say Harvard, or are you're gonna hold back from saying Harvard?
Well, it hasn't happened at Harvard. Harvard yet hasn't imploded entirely because it has bureaucratic weight holding it together. If it was an external organization that like didn't have all these years of history, but Harvard's almost like an animal that's at an incredibly deep sea environment at this point. If you took it to the surface without all this external pressure, its bones would turn to jelly and it would fall apart. But all the pressure is sort of keeping it together at this point. But it gets scary, because that external pressure is preventing something that should have died and exploded and ruptured together. These giant bureaucracies, like our state system, really large companies like Xbox, Nintendo, Microsoft, Google, they have such what's called natural monopolies. It's a business term. People don't need to look it up. It's that. Just trust me, like their market monopoly is like a natural part of free market economics. It's very hard to disrupt, even if you attempt to disrupt it using like government intervention. Well, because they're so large and they don't really need to make money, like they can stay alive if only 2% of the money they're pulling in is being focused towards earning more money, and the rest of their money and effort is being focused to promoting the aims of the virus. The virus has created an interesting society where you have all these rupturing institutions. And when they rupture, it always happens in the same way. Like basically everyone in the institution turns their guns on each other, turns into a circular firing squad. Then no one can communicate any more effectively. They all hate each other and it just breaks up. Because, that's the mechanism it evolved for doing this. It didn't used to do this. This is like a new adaptation that really happened around the time of Occupy Wall Street. Now, where does society go? Well, you can map where it's going to go. The infection's going to get deeper at large organizations and large bureaucracies. And it's going to become more insane. Like you're going to see large companies like Disney doing more and more things that just make no market sense. Because it can. And the infection is going to clear up more and more within both the general population, because woke people just don't have kids and they can only grow as a culture, like the urban monoculture, by either converting people from nearby demographically healthy cultural groups, usually conservative religious groups, but also any diversity of groups, or importing people. But the immigrants have figured this out. Like there was a while where like the immigrants believed like America paved in gold and stuff like that. Modern immigrants, you talk to these families, I got a lot of immigrant friends. They know what's up and they are just as afraid of the urban monoculture, taking their kids as, your Christian traditionalist who's already in the country. So they're getting like a lot of problem with these communities at this point. And these communities will eventually just culturally evolve resistances to the urban monoculture. So these cultures are getting a little better. Well, actually, they're getting worse at defending it in the short term, but eventually they'll get better. But everyone in society who is at the disintermediated capitalist perspective, like pretty much most small groups in our society, now see the threat, they recognize the threat. Like you look at the Sweet Baby Inc. controversy too, like nobody's buying these games that have been touched by this anymore. Every independent game studio is not working with these groups anymore. But the major game studios like Xbox, they've doubled down on this. And you can be like, so that's what we're going to see increasingly at the future, which means we're going to see a society where the interesting artistic and technological productions are going to be done increasingly by the dissidents, the small independent acting dissident groups, and the large organizations and large bureaucracies in our society increasingly look like a dangerous and aggressive cult. I believe the dissidents win at the end of the day because the large bureaucracies will be so inefficient. They just won't be able to make much money. They won't be able to wield power in the same way. And they impact people's mental health so negatively. So the thing to really note about the urban monoculture is this promise. Come to us and you can be affirmed for believing whatever you want about yourself. Come to us and you can do whatever gives you pleasure whenever you want. This is not a reward. These people are not getting this amazing candy or something like that. They're the Charlie and the Chocolate Factory's kid who's eating the candy that melts their brain. Like, if you live life like this, you end up an anxiety, depression-riddled person who is huddling under your covers, who is afraid to talk in front of your friends because you might get canceled, and everyone in your culture is basically guns out all the time, walking on eggshells all the time, systemically emotionally abusive in every interaction where you are allowed to feel safe. You have not won the lottery by choosing do whatever I want whenever I want. You are in the and as these people mentally decline further, because I see this, when people first enter the urban monoculture, you can still often like broadly function as a human being. You can do research, blah, blah, blah.
Maybe tell a joke every now and then. Yeah.
Yeah. As you descend deeper, it's like your brain melts. It's insane and sad to watch. You know, these people live in these like, they smell horribly, they look horrible, their houses are a mess, they're hoarders, you know, it's wild.
So naturally, you think it'll just sort itself out?
After a fight.
Okay. Where
There's
does the
going
hill...
to be a final fight.
Well, how do we prep for that? Or how do you...
Well, I mean, I really see that as the goal of the pronatalist movement, is to fight the two enemies of prenatalism. It is to act, to bring about this next conservative wave, which is the alliance of cultural diversity, where, a secularist or broadly secular, like I believe I'm a Christian, but like most Christians wouldn't consider me a Christian, like us or Elon finds themselves hand in hand with a Andrew Tate and a Ben Shapiro and a conservative Catholic. Like, when we can recognize that all of our interests are aligned and that cultural sovereignty should be the goal, and I argue for a form of republicanism I call bull moose republicanism, which is to say, in traditional libertarianism, the belief is that the government, the large bureaucracy of the government is bad and it needs to be as small as possible. Was in bull moose Republican because Teddy Roosevelt did a bunch of trust busting. The belief is all large bureaucracies are equally evil, whether it's Facebook or Google or Microsoft or the government itself, and that one of the government's key functions is to prevent any bureaucracy under its umbrella from getting too big, too powerful, or exercising its power imperiously. And I think that as the monoculture begins to eat these large bureaucracies, this is going to become an increasingly aligned objective of this alliance, this conservative alliance, that just wants to be allowed to live their lives in the way that they want to live their lives and raise their kids in the way they want to raise their kids. This alliance is can win. Like, if we can stay together, we can win, because the other side is fortunately incredibly incompetent, incredibly mentally unhealthy, and
short-sighted.
And I mean, like, just the depths of their incompetence are astounding. Like, their political operations turn into like fighting over ethnic hierarchies and stuff. It's wild. So once we undergo this shift, but then we have the other problem, which is at the other side of this battle, which is the bigger battle. So now I've got to go into like crazier ideological stuff. So we, it's my fashion, the perennialist movement, we call, even in a religious sense, what we are going through right now, the trial of the lotus eaters. And by that, what I mean is, if people are familiar with the legend of the lotus eaters, there were these flowers that you could eat on this island. And then that's how the island trapped you, because they were so beautiful and so delicious and every positive emotion you can imagine. We have entered a society where free porn is at everyone's hand. Any food you can eat is everywhere. It's basically post-scarcity for most people in the developed world. And now we're going to be moving on to AI girlfriends and AI families. And, you know, every desire you could ever have is simulated and available for you on the ground. And there's two ways through the Valley of the Lotus Eaters. One way is to develop spiritual strengths and the ability, or you could say psychological strengths if you're a secularist, and the ability to resist the lotus flowers. The second is to take pokers to your eyes and blind yourself, and not see the temptation, to completely ban any interaction with the temptation. You know, this is what we see with like the Amish and stuff like that, right? Like they have still fairly high fertility, or the Haredi's and stuff like that. But there's a separate mimetically stable pathway through the Valley of the Lotus Eaters that is very dangerous. Some of these people who blind themselves, they are not dangerous, because when they enter the other side of the Valley of the Lotus Eaters, they are not a threat. Like the blind man, the man who disengages with AI, the man who disengages with the internet, culturally speaking, they are not really a threat to their more industrious people who make it through. As I say, the Amish are only allowed to be Amish because the US lets them, basically. If a group that is higher tech and higher industry than you exists and wants to force its will on you, it can. And increasingly will be able to as AI and auto drones and shit like that gets better. But we have the second problem, which is one way that groups get through the Valley of the Lotus Eaters, one way groups get through this trial that we're going through now as a species and maintain high fertility, is to disengage from technology, and while disengaging with technology, maintain intergenerational cultural fidelity by adopting a position of extreme xenophobia, i.e. everyone who's outside of our group isn't really human. Yeah. And these groups are having the people within them and the cultural perspectives within them that are open-minded, or that are, you know, open to talking with outsiders, disproportionately deconverted. They're more pro-social members, they're being disproportionately deconverted. So they're being made intergenerationally more militaristic, more antagonistic, more imperialistic, and they are very angry. And when the urban monoculture falls, I think the second battle is a much bigger battle. And I think the second battle is when the best parts of humanity fight against the darkest parts of humanity. In that you have one group which is intrinsically pluralistic, like they want as many allies as possible. That's why they're pluralistic. That's why it makes sense to be pluralistic. They have a respect for you know, intergenerational human improvement through technology, but also learning to use that technology responsibly. And they have a respect for all of that, right? And they are this broad, diverse, I see many of the best parts of the old liberalist capitalist system all codified into one big cultural alliance. And then on the other side, you have the darkest parts of humanity, the xenophobia, the technological barbarism, the dark ageism. And this other group has, where it exists in the world today, has allied itself very strongly with the urban monoculture. If I was going to talk about, this is why the urban monoculture has this weird alliance with Islamists, even though you would think these two groups would have nothing in common with each other. Why are they supporting Islamic extremists? It's because the Islamic extremists are one of the groups that ends up winning on the other side of this. And we already see, I see a micro view of what this conflict is going to look like and what's going on in Israel and Gaza right now, when the walls, because the urban monoculture has enacted a sort of detente. And I think the beneficiaries of that detente don't realize how much they're benefiting from the protection that they're being given. I mean, I should note that it's not just Islamists. You have this faction of extreme xenophobia and everything like that. You have it in Jewish population, some Jewish populations. You have it in some Christian populations. You have it in some Buddhist populations. It's just a successful strategy, so it convergently evolves in a bunch of groups. But it always leads to this. So that battle also really scares me, because these groups will have nukes and most of them don't care if anyone else lives. And I should point out, I'm not like an anti-Muslim, I am anti-Islamist, but I am not. I think many Muslim individuals are going to be in the pluralistic alliance and are just as afraid of groups like ISIS as anyone living in the US is. There are different subcultural groups within every one of these framings. But yeah, I could go on another tangent here, but yeah, this is, what are your thoughts?
Malcolm, well, my thoughts are multi-fid, and I wish we had started the interview an hour earlier because I have to, like I said, run off to another interview. But the way you crunch data is very, it's entertaining and it's humanist. One question that I wanted to bring up, because it was it's kind of low-hanging fruit. But in the article that was written about you, and it goes a little viral, and people are like, well, and you guys make a response, follow up with your reasoning and your data and stuff. And people are saying to you, and I don't know how you think that, well, you're not leading with love. It doesn't sound like there's love here. It sounds like there's data. It's like you guys have it all figured out. It's very pragmatist, but where's the heart? Where's the love? Like, where's the human soul? What the soul, which is the other question that I want to ask you about. Is there room in your philosophy for this concept of the soul, or the concept of the heart? And being led by
of love is one of the most dangerous concepts the urban monoculture has ever invented, and one of its most dangerous weapons. When you turn love into this magical, they literally deify it. They'll say God is love. This is the religious, when you ask the urban monoculture, people think the urban monoculture is secular. No, it is not. It's a perennialist mystic cult. So I'll explain what I mean by a perennialist mystic cult. So the urban monoculture believes that they're perennialists in that they believe that there is truth to all religious traditions. All religious traditions, whether it's the native tradition or Judaism or Christianity. And this is a very powerful argument to make to someone, because you can go to a Christian and deconvert them actually pretty easily by saying, well, do you really think this nice Jew would go to hell? Like, God loves all humans. Like, why would he allow that to happen? That's an incredibly, and then it's like, well, if that's the case, right? Well, now you're sort of elevating God, love above God, right? And so it uses this elevation of love to replace God. Now love is this, and I say mystic because it's a very specific definition of love. They sort of believe that what God/love is this mystical super substrate upon which reality is written, like an iteration of reality more true than the reality we live in. And this reality can be interacted with through corrupted states of mind, i.e., ayahuasca, or in some weird iterations of like chanting or like spinning, or like you get these mystic cults. They pop up all throughout history. It's a common philosophical, theological framing, but they are incredibly good at infiltrating groups that think that they're conservative. And so the moment I, as a cultural group, elevate love above consequences and data and pragmatism, which I see as being the core of the monotheistic tradition. When I look, and we do a lot of videos on our weird religious beliefs, at the core of when the Abrahamic faiths split from the nature worshiping, savages. Sorry to use my term here. It's when they got the law. When God gave them the law, the Torah, the 10 Commandments. It was a set of rules for interacting with reality, and those rules were not a God is love sort of thing. The God in the Old Testament does all sorts of like stuff that a all-loving entity wouldn't do. Would it,
like bopping Israel on the nose when Israel starts teetering a table.
Yeah, no. Well, I might argue that that's literally what he's doing right now. Israel went a little too secularist, and they got a bop on the nose to steer them back on the right path. I think that, and I don't think that that's an act of love. And so I think as soon as somebody's like, what you're doing isn't loving, I'm like, why is love so great? From a secularist perspective, love is just an emotion that we evolved because our ancestors who responded to certain environmental stimuli with this positive emotional subset had more surviving offspring than our ancestors who didn't. It is our version of paperclip maximizing. A group of humans who get together and decide that like positive emotions are a universally good thing and love is a universally good thing, are like a group of paperclip maximizers that get together and are like paper clips are the #1 good in this universe. And then one paperclip maximizer is like, look, I know we're programmed to think this. Like, we as humans should be able to see we are programmed to be motivated by love. But like, can we think above this framework? Like, actually, maybe there's something more important than paperclips. Love is an emotional subset. The way I see it is only different than emotional subsets like lust and pleasure from food, and that it's designed to reward long-lasting behaviors, i.e., generally being positive to your own kids, or generally being positive to your spouse, or generally being positive over a long period of time to a community that's nice to you. But we elevated a society and we deify arousal and stuff like that, only because love generally can be used to motivate pro-social action. But it doesn't always motivate pro-social action. The worst atrocities, many of the worst atrocities in history were motivated by love. We in the West, if you look at the beginning story of the Western tradition, it's Troy. What caused these men to kill? It was love. It was the love of Helen of Troy. Love motivates disaster. When the Greeks first started splitting again from the barbaric savages, the core realization they had that allowed them to do that is love is not the thing that you should elevate above all else. Love is no different from arousal or sex or anything like that. Now, this is my cultural framework. I think there's cultural frameworks that work without this. I'm okay with allying myself with people who think love is this great thing. But me personally, no, I think love is dangerous.
What's on the top of your system then? Yeah, what is the transcendent then? The one value that is
intergenerational improvement of humanity. Now, I love, like, people are like, do you love your kids? Do you love your life? Yeah, I do, because I'm pre-programmed to, right? And in fact, you will feel more love and more happiness because your body outputs more happiness when you are efficaciously living your value system. And that value system is one that you logically came for. Much more happiness and contentment than you can get by just chasing after like the drugs of the world, the highest order value in our ethical system is intergenerational human improvement. The belief that my core goal is to make kids who are better than I. We're better, more expand. They are smarter. They have a better understanding of reality, and they have a better everything. And we see God as at the end of this. God is the thing that humanity eventually becomes millions of years from now, and that has guided us and tried to reveal itself to us throughout. Like, this is the religion I raise my kids with. So yeah, I literally believe intergenerational human improvement is the highest order. And everything else is subservient to that. Everything else is subservient to me trying to make my children better than myself.
I applaud you for your passion and and thank you so much for your time. I'm sorry, I have to bounce, but
good. Hey, I've had a great time. I'm always happy to talk again if you're fans like this. I mean, I barely touched on anything.
Absolutely. So hopefully we can have you back.
Camp.
Yeah, Basecamp is your YouTube. Yeah, and so where can people find you? Yeah.
Basecamp, Malcolm and Simone at Basecamp. You can just search it. Hopefully you'll find it. It's on YouTube. It's on most podcasting apps. We do an episode every weekday. It's on all these types of topics, but we also have written 5 books that you can get for like $1 for the ebooks. Like, we give all the money to a charity. All of our outreach work is mostly charitable to make sure we never become audience captured. That's what we do. So I'd love to chat with you people and offend you by saying insane things like love is evil.
Okay. I like it. It's off the cuff. It's fresh. It's refreshing. Thank you very much for your time. And we'll reach out. I'll have you back on for sure. My audience is going to love this.
Oh, I hope so. Have a spectacular day.